So I've read the gospel fragment that we have,
Mm-hmm.
and I've read the bit in the Golden Legend.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it seems like the bit in the Golden Legend, I don't know which, like he's always drawing from older sources in that book, I guess. Um, but in The Cloud of Unknowing, which is one of my favorite books, it uses Mary and Martha as these examples of contemplation and action, which of course it didn't invent. And it seems to be drawing from that story, like almost word for word in certain parts. You can kind of see like, oh, that sentence looks like it came from the Golden Legend account. And yeah, I don't know. I wish we had more teachings from Mary herself,
Mm-hmm.
or even just more of the gospel itself, because it's like I love the imagery of it and the story behind it, but I'm very much a content kind of person, and I feel like I don't have enough to grab onto, and maybe I'm you can help me with that.
Sure. So I often say that I feel like Mary Magdalene is one of the great, an enormous puzzle. And that in order to put the pieces of the puzzle together, we have to draw on different sources. And so sometimes, like, there's one piece that we find, for example, in the canonical text, but then there's another whole corner of it that comes from the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, from texts like Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, Pistis Sophia, so that we get parts of that emerge then and give us a fuller picture. And then there's all the different legends and stories and myths, and many of them are very conflicting. So you have to sift and sort through. And you also have to ask yourself, I think, an important question, because so we have such fragments. We really have fragments. Even the Gospel of Mary itself is in fragments, and there are missing pages. So every person coming to Mary Magdalene has to ask themselves the question, what sources do I consider to be authentic or legitimate? And we're all going to have different answers. But what I like to do as a historian, and a cultural historian in particular, is to sort of lay out the smorgasbord and then invite people to say, okay, this one feels like this is in agreement with what I'm really hungry for, and to choose and put that on their plate and see what that looks like. So I always love to start when I look at Mary Magdalene. I like to start with the canonical text. And the very first thing that we have to do for most of us is we actually have to clarify who she is and who she isn't in our own tradition of the Bible. Because for 1600 years, most people have inherited a very clouded, and I almost think of it like the Sistine Chapel. A number of years ago, they cleaned it off and they're like, oh, wait, what we thought were the colors weren't the real colors at all. So it's only starting to change in the past 5 to 10 years, but most people still are walking around in much of the world thinking that Mary Magdalene is some sort of prostitute. And so we have to clear off the images. She was not the adulteress. She was not the prostitute. And then you just get down to the hub, the kernel of who she is by that name. And it's the contemplative disciple who was part of Jesus's inner circle, who all the gospels agree was present at the crucifixion and present as the first witness of the resurrection. So we start with that. And then there comes the question, well, is Mary Magdalene the same person as Mary of Bethany or not? And that is a whole contentious debate that has divided East and West. And St. Augustine, and from the early church fathers, they were arguing, is Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany the same or different women? So you have to sort of try that on, almost like a pair of glasses, like, well, what happens if I look at Mary Magdalene and she is the same person as Mary Bethany? And what if she's different? But I think for myself, one of the sources that is so, so rich is these texts from Egypt that were part of the Christian tradition before the canon was formulated. And that is, I hope everybody knows that for hundreds of years, there was no uniform canon. It really wasn't until the 4th century that it was decided these are the books that are going to be the authorized version of who Jesus was. But if we look at the ones that were recovered in 1945, she's got these wonderful titles. She's known as the woman who knows all. She is the one, for example, one of my favorite stories is it's almost like one of those Greek teachings of Socrates, where you picture Jesus underneath the olive tree and all of the disciples are out there and they're asking questions and answers in this sort of Socratic dialogue. And she's the one who asked the most questions. And in fact, she's a lot like Hermione Granger from Harry Potter, because some of the other disciples, Peter in particular, gets really annoyed. And he says, "You're letting this woman talk so much." So we have this sense that she was part of the inner community, and that, you know, what we do know about Jesus, he was radically egalitarian. The way that he interacted with women, the kinds of attention that he gave them. You look at instance after instance after instance in the canonical texts, and you know, his disciples are criticizing him for talking to the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well. You know, you find these engagements that were very contrary to established norms. And so what we get in the Nag Hammadi text is this idea of this wisdom teacher of Jesus who welcomes into his inner circle both men and women. And I kind of describe Mary Magdalene as the star student. You know, she's the one who understands when many of the others don't. So we've got that element from early Christian texts, although they're not canonical texts, but they were used by people who called themselves Christians, and that's who Mary Magdalene was. And then you have the whole French tradition here that's the root of the contemplative tradition, and you can kind of piece together, if you compare John Cassian's writings and realize that John Cassian was working on two main sources. You know, he was working on the material that he had gathered together for 10 years in the desert tradition of Egypt with the so-called desert fathers and mothers, and he was drawing on local traditions and oral traditions that were from La Sainte-Baume. And that by that time, that was already the place that had been established as a pilgrimage site, with the veneration of Magdalene's relics. And one of the things the Cassianite monks did is that they guarded Magdalene's relics. So I like to look at those historical traditions, to go back as far as I can to find, well, what are the earliest sources and what do the earliest sources say? Because the work that you mentioned, the Golden Legend, was written by a Dominican, and that was in, I believe, the 14th century, where it was finally collected together. And that's more than a little bit problematic. And the reason why that's problematic is that in the year 1209, the Albigensian Crusade had been launched by the Dominicans with an express purpose of eradicating heresy in southern France. And as you look at what was the heresy really involved different teachings that traced their roots to what the adherents claimed were their authentic teachings that had been passed down orally from Mary Magdalene and Mary Magdalene's disciples. And so the world's first Holocaust began then. That's what the medieval Inquisition was launched to, specifically to wipe out the heresies of southern France, most of which had to do with the role of women in the church, because women were preachers and teachers and spiritual leaders within the so-called Cathar tradition. And many of their teachings, which differed radically from what the teachings of Rome were. Now, interestingly, they're not that different from many other teachings that came later, like in the Protestant Reformation. And all kinds of questions like, what is the role of religious hierarchy here? You know, do you have, in order to be saved, do you have to have a priest? What is the pathway of salvation or healing? You know, all of these questions which we've fought about in the world for centuries and centuries and centuries, they were at play then too. So when I say we have to kind of look very carefully at the Golden Legend, part of the reason that Mary Magdalene becomes the patron saint of the Dominican order is, according to some scholars, is that she was the patron saint of southern France. And the only way that the people who were heretics would embrace the Church of Rome was by sort of transferring their love of Mary Magdalene into a more acceptable format. So that's one way to look at it. So in the Golden Legend, you know, the Golden Legend is a wonderful book. in many ways, it's like the fairy tales of the saints. And what you have to know is that, I mean, this is part of the painful history of Christianity, is at the time, if you were a lay person in the 13th century, you were forbidden from reading the Bible upon threat of burning. And that was in direct response to the teachings of the so-called Cathars, who went from village to village to village, teaching people how to read the Gospel of John in the vernacular language. And if you even owned a Bible in the vernacular language in the 13th or 14th centuries, you would be burned at the stake. It was considered high treason and heresy. So instead, what was authorized were books of hours, which were prayers and devotions. Beautiful. I mean, they're beautiful books, these illuminated manuscripts. You were allowed to have that, and you were allowed to have the Golden Legend, because that was the teachings of what the church said were the appropriate stories for you to know about the different saints. And some of them are marvelous stories, but we have to put on an inquiring mind about why were these stories authorized, and what were other stories that were told, and were there political reasons for it. So there's all of that sort of critique to go through.